The Academy station Valeran 9 floated in the amber glow of a dying star, its crystalline docking spires catching the light like the fingers of something ancient and thoughtful. It was considered the finest institution of xenobiological study in the known coalition, which spanned 47 star systems and contained enough accumulated knowledge to fill several small moons. Professor Thaxis of the Valoran species had taught here for 51 years, and in that time he had developed two certainties. The first was that knowledge was absolute. The second was that he possessed most of it. He entered the lecture chamber precisely on time, as he always did, his 6 limbs moving in that fluid, rolling gait characteristic of his people. His bioluminescent patches glowed a deep, satisfied violet, the Valoran equivalent of someone straightening their tie before a performance. The chamber was a perfect sphere, with tiered seating curving all the way around so that students could observe from every angle. Today, it held 63 students representing 22 different species. Coalition Law 7 required all diplomatic and scientific personnel to complete Foundation Xenobiology before receiving their credentials. It was, in Thaxis's professional opinion, the most important class any of them would ever take. He let them settle. He enjoyed watching new students find their seats, the crystalline Farathi with their geometric precision, the wide, low Doric who preferred floor-level cushions, the gaseous Sorvath who drifted in sealed environmental pods along the upper tier. And then the mammals. There were always a few mammals, warm-blooded, soft-shelled, inefficient little creatures who had somehow clawed their way to spaceflight through what Thaxis could only describe as aggressive stubbornness. He'd taught Gorvani, Pleshy, a few Cathari. They were fine students, earnest, fragile. They sat in padded seats near the exits, which their species apparently preferred for psychological comfort reasons. This semester, there was a human. Thaxis had noticed the enrollment flag when preparing his course roster, a human. From the Sol system, 3rd planet, Class 7 moderate world, newly admitted to the Coalition approximately 14 months ago. The file had been thin, the survey data unremarkable. Standard oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere, moderate axial tilt, predictable seasons, carbon-based biosphere. Nothing unusual. The surveyor had signed off on it in what appeared to be a single afternoon. The human, one Jonas Mercer, sat in the 4th tier. He was unremarkable in appearance, medium height for a biped, dark hair cut short, dressed in the standard issue gray uniform all new Coalition students wore before selecting their academic house color. He had a portable data pad balanced on his knee and was apparently writing notes before the lecture had even begun, which Thaxis found either admirable or insufferably presumptuous. He hadn't decided which. "Welcome," Thaxis said, his translator implant smoothing his clicks and resonance tones into Coalition standard. "For those who don't know me, I am Professor Thaxis. I have published 312 peer-reviewed papers, authored the definitive 6-volume series on comparative planetary biology, and served as chief xenobiological consultant during the admission surveys of 11 new species. I tell you this not to impress you, but to establish that when I make a declarative statement in this classroom, it carries the weight of 5 decades of verified, rigorous science." He let that settle. A few students shifted. Good. "Today's lecture," he continued, pulling up a holographic star map that bloomed in the center of the spherical chamber like a flower made of light, concerns perhaps the most persistent and tiresome myth in all of xenobiological science, the catastrophe world hypothesis. He spoke the words with the particular emphasis of someone putting finger quotes around something embarrassing. The idea, beloved by sensationalist media producers and conspiracy theorists with too much free time, that somewhere in our galaxy there exist planets so extraordinarily dangerous, so unreasonably hostile, that they should by all accounts be incapable of producing complex life, and yet somehow have. He began pacing. Pacing helped. It gave the students something to track. This hypothesis is popular precisely because it is dramatic. It appeals to our instinct for spectacle. Imagine a world where the weather actively tries to kill you, where every creature in the ecosystem is locked in perpetual violence, where the atmosphere itself is a fire hazard. Thrilling, yes? The stuff of cheap entertainment. But let me tell you what it is not. He paused. Science. He replaced the star map with a gradient chart, the Voss-Kellian scale of planetary habitability, which he had personally contributed 3 revisions to. Life adapts to its environment. This is not a theory. It is the most consistently verified principle across every biosphere we have ever studied. Harsh conditions produce simple organisms. Moderate conditions allow for complexity. And intelligent technological life, the kind that builds cities and composes music and eventually points telescopes at the sky, requires stability, predictability, an environment that is not, in scientific terms, actively trying to commit murder. Several students made sounds or body language gestures indicating amusement. Vaxis had given this lecture many times. He knew where the loss landed. The proposed conditions of a so-called catastrophe world include, he continued, reading from the holographic display with theatrical weariness, volatile atmospheric oxygen concentrations, extreme weather events of planetary scale, continental tectonic instability, and ecosystems in which every organism has evolved specifically to either kill or avoid being killed. And these conditions are supposed to have produced not just complex life, but spacefaring civilization. He closed the display. It hasn't. It won't, because it can't. The mathematics of evolutionary biology simply do not support it. That was when Jonas Mercer raised his hand. Daxus noticed the motion, a simple upward extension of one arm, patient and unhurried. He recognized it as the Coalition's standard gesture for requesting the floor. He also recognized, somewhere in the back of his highly educated mind, the expression on the human's face. It was polite. It was attentive. It was the expression of someone who had been taking careful notes and had now reached a point where the notes had led them somewhere interesting. Yes, Thaxus said, noting the name on his roster. Mercer, you have a question? A few, actually. His voice was calm, conversational. But I'll start with one. When you list the conditions that define a catastrophe world, specifically the atmospheric oxygen percentage and the tectonic instability index, what threshold values are you using? Because the ranges I've seen cited in the literature vary quite a bit depending on the author. The Thexus blinked his primary eyes. It was a reasonable question, a technical question, the kind a serious student asked. The Galactic standard defines volatile oxygen concentration as anything exceeding 14% by atmospheric volume, he said. Beyond that threshold, uncontrolled combustion becomes a systemic risk to complex organic structures. Right, Jonas said, nodding slowly. He glanced at his datapad. So, for reference, Earth's atmosphere is approximately 21% oxygen. The chamber was quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, said Drev, a Farathi student in the second tier, her crystalline body catching the light in sharp angles. 21, Jonas repeated, percent, oxygen, by volume. The Thexus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. That would place your planet well above the Galvith combustion threshold. Yes, Jonas agreed, pleasantly. That means your planet's surface is, by the established definition, a persistent fire risk. We call them wildfires, Jonas said. They happen regularly, millions of hectares. We have entire agencies dedicated to managing them. It's a significant annual problem. He paused. We also cook with open flame, intentionally, in our homes. The StorWhat in the upper pods made a sound like a sustained vibration note. The Doric in the floor seats rippled their body folds, which indicated deep unease. Thexis pulled up the planetary survey file on his personal display. Class 7 moderate world, standard atmospheric composition. He stared at the oxygen figure on the file. It read 12%. He looked at the human. He looked back at the file. This survey, he said slowly, was done pretty quickly, Jonas agreed. I think the surveyor spent about 6 hours in orbital observation before filing the report. Lovely person, apparently. Very enthusiastic. Very ready to go home. Thexis's luminescent patches flickered from violet to an uncertain pale blue. Perhaps, he said carefully, you could tell the class a little more about your planet's conditions, for academic purposes, to illustrate the survey discrepancy. Jonas looked faintly pleased. Not smug, there was a distinction, but pleased in the way that someone looks when they realize a conversation is about to go somewhere genuinely interesting. He set his datapad aside. Sure, he said. So, gravity first. Earth's surface gravity is approximately 9.8 meters per second squared, which is on the higher end for coalition member homeworlds. We're denser than we look as a species because of it. Bones calibrated for that pull, muscles built for sustained exertion against real resistance. When coalition doctors first ran physical assessments on our early diplomatic crew, the bone density readings apparently caused 2 of the scanners to flag errors. The Pharathe student, Drev, tilted her geometric head. What kind of errors? The kind that said, this biological structure cannot be a naturally evolved organism, Jonas said. They thought the scanner was broken, ran it 3 times. Moving on, Thexis said, though his voice had lost some of its authority. Weather, Jonas continued. So Earth has a hydrological cycle, which most habitable worlds do, but ours also generates these rotating storm systems called hurricanes. They form over warm ocean surfaces, develop organized spiral structures, and can sustain wind speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour across a diameter of several hundred kilometers, sometimes wider. 300, repeated a Doric student from the floor level. The translation came out flat, like the number itself had broken the sentence. Peak gusts can exceed that, Jonas said. The storms can maintain strength for weeks. They move, so you often can't simply stay out of their path. You evacuate, or you shelter and wait. We've built our coastal cities accounting for them. He paused. Also, there's a separate category of storm called a tornado. Much smaller diameter, much faster winds. Some exceed 480 kilometers per hour. They descend from thunderstorm systems with very little warning time, maybe 12 minutes of advance notice on a good day. 12 minutes, Thexis repeated. Average, Jonas said. Sometimes less. We have a whole science dedicated to chasing them. Researchers drive toward active tornadoes to collect data, voluntarily. It's a real career. The chamber had taken on a particular quality of silence that Thexis recognized from exactly one prior experience in his teaching career, and not had been the semester a student had accidentally released a contained specimen of Veth-class microorganisms into the ventilation system. It was the silence of people recalculating their relationship with safety. And the wildlife, Jonas continued, and his tone was still perfectly conversational, still the tone of someone describing ordinary facts to people who had simply not encountered them yet. Earth has approximately 8 to 10 million species, depending on classification methodology. The majority of complex animal life operates on predator-prey dynamics. Our apex land predators include large felids, cats scaled up, that can sprint at over 110 kilometers per hour and take down prey 3 times their mass. There are ursine species, bears, that can weigh over 700 kilograms, possess enough strength to bend structural metal with their forelimbs, and are capable of remaining conscious and active after injuries that would be clinically fatal to most organisms. The pale blue of Thexis's luminescence had drifted toward gray. Our oceans contain the largest animals to have ever existed on Earth. Blue whales, 25 to 30 meters long, approximately 150,000 kilograms. They're not predators in the conventional sense, they filter feed on tiny organisms. But the fact that life on our planet got that large without some form of regulatory control tells you something about our biosphere's available energy density. He picked up his datapad again. We also have great white sharks, which have changed their basic body plan remarkably little in about 16 million years because evolution apparently decided they were efficient enough and left them alone. Someone in the upper tier whispered something in their native language. The translation implants rendered it as, "Why would evolution leave something alone unless it was already perfect at what it does?"
Exactly, Jonas said, apparently catching the translation. He looked up at the chamber. And we're the apex predators, humans. We're at the top of that system. Daraxis was very still. This was not his standard lecture stillness. This was the stillness of a large and complex mind attempting to reboot after encountering irreconcilable data. How? Said Drev, carefully. Endurance, Jonas said. Persistence. We're not the fastest or the strongest, but we can run for a very long time. We sweat, thermoregulate through evaporative cooling, which means we can operate in heat that forces other animals to stop and rest. We're also very good at learning, building tools, and cooperating in large groups. We hunted in teams. We remembered where animals went. We planned across time. He shrugged slightly, the way someone shrugs when describing something so familiar it barely registers as remarkable. And we never really stopped. Theraxis looked at his survey file again. Class 7, moderate world. Then he looked at his student. Mr. Mercer, he said, and his luminescence had gone completely gray. I think perhaps you should continue. All of it. Jonas nodded, set his datapad on his knee, looked around the chamber at 62 alien students who had gone very, very quiet. Okay, he said. So, human biology. The chamber was silent in the way that deep space is silent. Not the absence of sound so much as the presence of something too large to make noise. Jonas Mercer looked unhurried. He looked, if anything, slightly interested in his own subject matter, the way a person looks when they're about to explain something they've never had to explain before and find the novelty of it quietly amusing. Professor Thexis had not moved from his position at the center of the chamber. His luminescent patches have remained gray for the past 3 minutes, which for a Valoran was the biological equivalent of sitting very still in a dark room and waiting for the universe to start making sense again. Human biology, Jonas said. Right, so I'll start with the healing factor because it tends to get the strongest reaction. He glanced at his datapad, then set it aside again. He clearly didn't need it. Our skeletal structure is made primarily of calcium phosphate matrix, bone, which is dense, load-bearing, and, relevant to this conversation, self-repairing. Most skeletal structures have some regenerative capacity, said a Farathi student named Drev, her crystalline facets angled toward him with careful attention. She was the only one still asking follow-up questions. The others had taken on the expressions of people watching something they couldn't look away from, regardless of whether they wanted to. Sure, Jonas agreed. Basic calcium deposition, slow remodeling over time. Ours does that, but also, and here's the part that startled the Coalition's first medical assessment team, if a bone breaks, the body treats it as a priority repair event. White blood cells converge. A calcified callus forms at the fracture site within days. Over weeks, that callus remodels into structured bone. The repair site is often, when fully healed, marginally denser than the original material. Marginally denser, Thexis repeated from somewhere that sounded like the inside of a long, dark tunnel. At the fracture point specifically, not always, but often enough that it's a documented phenomenon. Jonas paused. We also routinely break bones and continue functioning, not comfortably, but functionally. There are documented cases of people working, competing, even, and one famous case, finishing a wilderness survival course on a fractured limb, because the alternative was worse. A Doric student on the floor level made a long, low sound. The immune system is maybe more interesting from a xenobiological standpoint, Jonas continued. It operates on two tiers. The innate response, fast, general, the body throwing everything at an unrecognized threat, and the adaptive response, which is slower but specific and crucially has memory. Memory, said Drave. If your body encounters a pathogen, a bacterium, a virus, a foreign protein, and survives, the adaptive immune system creates a structural template of that specific threat. Specialized cells retain that template, potentially for decades, potentially for life, depending on the pathogen. If the same threat appears again, the response time drops from days to hours, sometimes less. He tilted his head. We've also learned to artificially trigger this. We introduce a disabled or fragmented version of a pathogen, too weak to cause disease, and the body develops the memory template anyway. We call them vaccines. We've eliminated several species-level epidemic diseases this way. Completely. They no longer exist in the wild because we made our own bodies inhospitable to them until they ran out of hosts. Somewhere in the upper tier, a Sorvoth pod vibrated with an extended, uncomfortable frequency. You drove pathogens to extinction, Thexus said. Some of them, Jonas agreed. Others we're working on. The ones that mutate quickly are harder. He paused. There's also a thing where our immune system occasionally gets over-enthusiastic and attacks our own tissue by mistake. We have a whole category of diseases from that. Autoimmune conditions. Our bodies are, in some cases, too aggressive about threats. The machinery is calibrated for a very hostile environment. Your planet, Drave said slowly.
Very hostile environment, Jonas confirmed. Our biology knows this. It's been calibrated for it for roughly 300,000 years of modern human existence, and a few million years before that if you count our hominid ancestors. He stretched slightly, the way someone stretches when they've been sitting for a while, a motion so ordinary it read as almost offensive against the weight of the conversation. Should I keep going? Several students made various noises. None of them were no. Pain tolerance, Jonas said. So pain exists as a signal system, a warning. Tissue damage registers, the signal travels to the brain interprets it as a priority response request. What varies between species is how that priority competes with other processing. He thought for a moment. For humans, the threshold at which pain overrides functional cognition is quite high, higher than most species based on comparative neurological studies done on our first year of coalition contact. We can remain oriented, goal-directed, and behaviorally consistent through injury levels that produce unconsciousness or incapacitating distress responses in most other intelligent organisms. Why? Said the Doric student on the floor, and the word came out with the weight of genuine philosophical inquiry. We think it's because our evolutionary history required it, Jonas said. An ancestor who got injured during a hunt and immediately became non-functional didn't survive. An ancestor who got injured, registered the signal, filed it for later, and finished what they were doing, they made it back. Natural selection over millions of years produced an organism that can, he paused, table the pain. Table the pain, Thexus repeated. Put it aside temporarily. Deal with it later. This is why, in coalition medical assessments, human patients have repeatedly alarmed physicians by describing injury severity as considerably lower than the tissue damage objectively indicates. Jonas looked mildly thoughtful. There's a famous early contact story where a human crew member told the coalition ship's medical officer she was fine, just a bit sore, after what the scanner indicated was a fractured collarbone and 3 cracked ribs. The medical officer filed a report suggesting the translator was malfunctioning. A sound moved through the chamber. It wasn't quite laughter and wasn't quite distress. It was the sound of 62 alien minds processing something that didn't fit any existing framework. All right, Jonas said. Voluntary activities. Thexus's luminescence flickered. Do we have to? You said to continue, Jonas pointed out reasonably. Thexus said nothing. Thexus had given up saying things. Humans have recreational activities that involve deliberate exposure to physical risk.
Jonas said. Not simulated risk, actual risk. We have a sport called free solo climbing where individuals scale vertical rock faces of several hundred meters using only their hands and feet and no safety equipment. If they fall, they die. People train for years, select climbs carefully, and then do it. The ones who are very good at it become famous within our culture. Famous, Drev said. The word came out hollow. Celebrated, Jonas confirmed. We have another called base jumping, leaping from fixed structures like buildings, bridges, or cliff edges, and deploying a parachute. The margin between chute opens in time and chute does not open in time is measured in seconds. We have another called free diving, where people descend to depths of over 300 meters on a single breath of air, past the threshold where pressure causes significant physiological stress, and return to the surface under their own power. He paused. The current record is held by a man named Herbert Nitsch, over 250 meters on one breath.
Drev's crystalline facets made a sound like cracking glass, which Thexis understood was her species' stress response. Cave diving, Jonas continued, navigating flooded underground tunnel systems where a navigation error or equipment failure means drowning in complete darkness with no rescue possible. Wingsuit flying, wearing a fabric suit that generates lift and gliding through narrow mountain passes at speeds over 200 kilometers per hour. Volcano boarding, he said, and paused for a beat. Riding a metal board down the slopes of an active volcano. Active? Said Thexis. Not actively erupting at that exact moment, Jonas said. That distinction, Thexis said slowly, is doing enormous work in that sentence. We also have a thing called a marathon, Jonas said, a foot race over 42 kilometers. During the race, muscle tissue experiences small-scale structural damage, glycogen reserves deplete, the body enters metabolic distress states, and people finish anyway. Every year, millions of humans run marathons. Some people, not satisfied with 42 kilometers, run races called ultramarathons, 100 kilometers, some in desert environments, some through mountain ranges. He looked around the chamber. For fun. The Doric student had folded themselves into a compact shape that Thexis understood was their defensive posture. The Sorvath pods were vibrating at a low, continuous frequency. 3 students had very quietly submitted requests to change their seating assignment, which the chamber's administrative system had flagged as unusual mid-lecture behavior. Food, Jonas said. Oh no, said someone. We eat a chemical compound called capsaicin. Plants produce it as a deterrent. It binds to pain receptors in the mouth and throat and produces a burning sensation. We have a standardized measurement scale for how intensely a given plant produces this compound. We cultivate those plants. We put them in our food. We have competitive events to see who can consume the most painful variety. He thought for a moment. There are peppers that require participants to sign medical waivers. People have been hospitalized. The events are popular. You eat pain, Drev said. We eat something that causes pain and have developed a cultural appreciation for the sensation, Jonas said, with the precision of someone who has thought about this distinction before. There's also ethanol. It's a byproduct of organic fermentation. Chemically, it's a toxin, impairs neurological function, damages liver tissue with repeated exposure, and in sufficient quantities causes death. We consume it at celebrations, at social gatherings, at the end of a difficult work period. We have extensive cultural traditions around its production and consumption. The chamber was doing that deep space silence thing again. We also keep large predators as companion animals, Jonas continued. Dogs, domesticated from wolves over approximately 15,000 years of selective breeding. They retain pack instincts, territorial behaviors, and bite forces capable of fracturing bone. We keep them in our homes, around our children, and consider them family members. He paused.
We also keep cats, which are less domesticated. They retain most of their hunting instincts and kill billions of small animals annually as recreational behavior. We think this is charming." The Raxus stood very still for a long moment. Then he said, "Mr. Mercer, you mentioned earlier that Earth is considered moderate." "Right," Jonas said, "among human-compatible worlds. Our preliminary survey teams have identified several candidate colony sites in our local cluster," Jonas said, with the tone of someone discussing routine administrative matters. "Higher gravity than Earth, more active tectonics." The survey team used the phrase "a bit lively" in their assessment notes. "Denser predator populations, weather patterns that our modeling teams described as significantly more dynamic than Earth baseline." He tilted his head. "We're pretty optimistic about them." Something happened to Thaxus's luminescence that had never happened to it before. It went beyond gray, through a shade that had no name in the Valorant Emotional Color Index, and into a kind of dim, pulsing uncertainty that looked less like a mood and more like a distress beacon. "You're optimistic about worse planets," Thraxus said. "More challenging," Jonas corrected, gently. "We think of it as more opportunity. The Coalition gave us access to faster transit technology, and now we can actually reach these sites. That was a significant part of why we applied to join, to be honest." He said this straightforwardly, without any apparent awareness that it might be alarming. "Our current population projections suggest we'll need colony capacity within the next century, and our drive systems before Coalition contact were pretty limited. Now we can actually go." The chamber was so quiet that the ambient hum of the station's life support system was audible. Thraxus said, "Your species joined the Galactic Coalition primarily to acquire propulsion technology." "That and the cultural exchange and scientific collaboration," Jonas said. "We're genuinely interested in that. Humanity has always been curious about what's out there." He paused. "But yes, the ships were a significant factor." Several things happened simultaneously. A Farathi student stood and said in a very controlled voice that she needed to contact her homeworld's diplomatic office. A Doric student deflated completely and was gently ushered out by a classmate. Two Sorvath pods accelerated upward toward the chamber's exit port, and somewhere in the Galactic Coalition's distributed communication network, an automated system flagged a sudden spike in encrypted transmissions originating from educational facility Velarin 9, cross-referencing key terms including catastrophe world, soul system, human biology, population expansion, and a phrase that didn't exist in the xenobiological database 24 hours ago: voluntary capsaicin consumption. Jonas watched students leave with mild curiosity. "Did I say something wrong?" he asked.
Thexus looked at him for a very long time. 51 years of teaching, 312 papers, 6 volumes of comparative biology that were, he now understood, going to require extensive revision. He had built a career on the absolute certainty that the universe followed rules, that life made sense, that intelligence emerged from stability, not from impossible environments that should have killed everything they touched a million years before those things developed language. "Mr. Mercer," he said finally, "I need to know one more thing." "Sure," Jonas said. "When your species looks at the rest of the galaxy," Dexus said carefully, "what do you see?" Jonas considered this. He looked at the holographic star map still rotating in the center of the chamber, its hundreds of cataloged systems glowing soft and distant and numerous. "Somewhere interesting to go," he said. Dexus nodded slowly. He gathered his materials. He walked to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and, without turning around, said, "Class is suspended pending a full review of the planetary classification standards that I have apparently been teaching incorrectly for 5 decades. I will be in contact with the administration. There will also be a mandatory revision of the Coalition's survey methodology guidelines, which I intend to author myself." A pause. "You will receive full credit for this course." "Thank you, Professor," Jonas said. "Don't thank me," Dexus said. I'm doing it because the coalition needs to know what it's invited in. I mean that as a professional assessment, not a criticism." He left. The door closed. Jonas sat alone in the chamber for a moment, looking at the star map. Then he picked up his datapad and opened a new message. He typed quickly, the way someone types when they have good news to share with people who will appreciate it. "Mom, Dad, first week of classes going well. Had a really interesting lecture today. I think I made an impression. Met some fascinating people. The professor seemed very engaged with the material." He paused, added, "I think I'm going to like it here. The galaxy is huge and everyone seems very curious about Earth once you get them talking." He sent it, stood up, picked up his bag. Somewhere in the administrative core of Valeran 9, a committee was being assembled with urgency. Somewhere in the Coalition diplomatic archives, a file labeled Sol System, Species Assessment, Review Required, was being updated with a priority flag for the first time in the Coalition's 400-year history. Somewhere in a faculty lounge 3 corridors away, Professor Thexus was sitting with a beverage he'd never tried before, staring at the wall and rethinking every assumption he had ever held about the relationship between danger and life. And Jonas Mercer walked out into the corridor of a galactic space station, looked at the amber light of the dying star filtering through the observation panels, thought it was honestly pretty beautiful, and went to find out what the cafeteria had on offer. He was hungry. He'd been hoping they had something spicy.